This is Sustainability Forward with Wrishi and Carmine.
Hey, Carmine, how are you today?
Hello, Richie. Oh, good. Oh, good. Nice to be back.
Nice to be back. And before we get into the meat of the episode that we have, I actually read about something really interesting. I mean, by the way, we are going to talk about whether 100% decarbonization of electricity is possible or not. But I have something interesting that I read about, and I thought I'll share with you and with our audience as well. So for decades, if you wanted to describe industrial scale, many people pointed to, the Boeing Everett facility in Washington in the United States. It is famous as the largest manufacturing building in the world by volume, and it is spread over 98 or almost 100 acres and encloses 472 million cubic feet. Yeah.
It's hardly difficult. It's difficult to picture this. Just an area for comparison, this is roughly 74 American football fields laid side by side, or more than 3 times of footprint of Disneyland. If you're a parent and bringing your kids around, you probably understand how big and crazy it could be. If you drop in a city, it will be 6 to 10 full city blocks.
Yeah. But now let's compare that with this proposed AI data center project in Utah, which is a state in the United States. And the project is called the Stratos project. That project apparently has land secured of about 40,000 acres, So 100 acres for the Boeing facility, and here we are talking about 40,000 acres. Now, I'm not saying all of this will be occupied immediately, but right now the sanctioned land for this project seems to be 40,000 acres.
Wow, that's extraordinary. Going back to your example, that was the icon of the old industrial scale and was already considered as a gigantic factory. Now we have a new icon of the new industrial scale that will be led by data center.
Absolutely. That is already turning out to be true. Data centers are clearly becoming, mainstream industrial facilities in many ways. Now, the power consumption number is even more striking. So there are reports that say that the Stratos project could reach up to 9 gigawatts at full build out. So just for comparison, Utah, the state's entire retail capacity consumption or electricity consumption is around 4 gigawatts across the year. So just the data center alone within Utah will have twice the energy consumption of the entire state of Utah.
So the question becomes how we can build a power system that is not only bigger, but also potentially decarbonized, because we will see more and more of this electricity demand coming from increasing population, new industrial applications such as the data centers, and much more.
Absolutely. And that is the key question for today's episode. And so we welcome all our audiences to Sustainability Forward. Today we are asking a question that sounds simple, but it really isn't, which is, can we fully decarbonize electricity?
And we not just mean, okay, we add a lot of solar panels, or we buy some renewable certificates. We mean, can the power system run without fossil emissions, reliably, affordably, efficiently, every hour of the year?
Yeah, the International Energy Agency, IEA, has called the coming time as the age of electricity. And it thinks the world is clearly moving in that direction. The assumption is that more of our transport, heating, industry, cooling, data centers, and digital lives are going to depend on electricity. And this demand is going to continue to grow through the 2030s. And it'll be driven by the things that I've mentioned: industry, electric vehicles, air conditioning, and definitely data centers.
So this is it's not just about cleaning up today's grid, it's about cleaning up a much bigger future grid.
That is the big point. Decarbonizing electricity is one of the most important parts of energy transition because clean electricity becomes the platform for decarbonizing everything else.
So let's deep dive in this episode with the first chapter. So what does 100% actually mean? Let's start with this definition.
Yeah.
When people say 100% clean electricity or 100% renewable electricity, they don't always mean the same thing.
No, they don't. And that is an important distinction. 100% renewable grid usually means electricity from sources like wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, and potentially sustainable bioenergy.
Whereas 100% decarbonized or 100% clean grid could also include nuclear or potentially fossil generation with carbon capture, depending on the definition.
That is correct. So one question is, are we trying to build a grid that is strictly renewable or one that is zero carbon? Those two are different debates.
Yeah. And there is also another nuance here. Are we talking about annual matching or we're talking about hourly matching?
Yeah, that is an important question also. A country or company might say we use 100% renewable electricity over the year because total renewable generation equals total electricity consumption. But that does not mean that every hour is fossil free.
Because you may have too much solar at midday, but still rely on gas at night.
Correct, right? So you might end up producing almost full renewable energy for the whole country, but you might still depend on gas. So that's the real challenge. And not just producing enough clean electricity over the year, but matching this supply and demand hour by hour across seasons and even during extreme events.
Let's go to the second point. Let's try to define what is the easy part and the hard part of this debate. So the challenge is getting to 100% or is getting close to 100%?
I would say getting to 70, 80, or even 90% clean electricity is becoming increasingly achievable in many systems. Wind and solar are scaling fast. Costs have fallen dramatically, which we have discussed many times on this podcast. And batteries are now a serious part of grid planning.
So the IEA that you mentioned before almost expects 4,600 gigawatt of renewable power capacity additions globally between 2025 and 2030, with solar PV making up nearly 80% of that growth.
That is truly what I'd say extraordinary. Solar is becoming the default new power source in many parts of the world.
And we discussed also in previous episode, for example, what's happening in India, in Pakistan.
Yes.
We never saw such a technology coming to the market with such a speed and scale. But also let's have a look at the final 10 to 20%.
Yeah, so that last stretch, and probably that's the same with any technology or trend adoption, right? That last stretch is all about reliability. What happens during a cold, winter week? What happens when demand spikes? And what happens when the grid has too much solar at midday and not enough clean power in the evening?
So the problem changes. Early on, the question is, how do we build enough clean generation? Later, the question becomes, how do we build a clean system?
Exactly. And you can almost you see this idea playing out. In India, where there is significant demand, solar capacity is being built up significantly. In some countries in Europe, we are already seeing this, right? Where there is a lot of solar or wind that has been installed, so renewable capacity, generation capacity is increasing. Now it's a question of being able to match it with demand on an hour by hour basis, if that is even possible. So we need a system that has flexibility, it has storage capability, transmission, demand response, and some kind of firm clean power.
Yeah. So let's go to the third chapter. So if we have wind and solar that are the backbone, what else do we need?
Yeah, first one beyond wind and solar is storage, but not just one type of storage. Batteries are very good for short duration balancing, moving solar from midday into evening peak, for example.
Yes. And we discussed how the price and the cost of batteries is going down and down, making really competitive in the whole energy ecosystem. But batteries alone may not solve a week-long period of low wind, for example.
Yeah, batteries won't. So we also need what is called longer duration options. Pumped hydro is well known, thermal storage, hydrogen, compressed air, and maybe even newer battery chemistries are needed.
So we're talking about potential energy that is stored somewhere chemically or via any other source of energy. But we also need grids.
We do. This is probably the most underrated part of the transition. A clean electricity system requires massive grid expansion, and that includes new transmission lines, distribution upgrades, substations, interconnectors, and the ability to control this infrastructure digitally.
Yes. It's not enough to generate electricity, you need to move it. You need to move it from where it is abundant to where it's needed, from when it's produced to where it's consumed. And if before in the world we have very simple left to right kind of network, now we have decentralized kind of network. It makes it more and more difficult.
Yeah. And beyond that, we need flexibility of demand, which means that having the ability of shifting some demand to periods when clean electricity is plentiful.
Like smart TV charging, for example.
Yes, EVs, heat pumps, as we have discussed before, industrial loads, data centers, cold storage, hot water systems, all of these can potentially respond to availability of clean power.
So instead of grid always chasing demand, some demand starts following the grid.
And that is a huge shift because we haven't seen anything like that so far.
And the bit of it that we all the digital technologies, and also because we are talking about electrons here, this is now possible. Let's bring to some real example, Rishi. So did some research, and let's start, for example, with the Uruguay. Let's go to Latin America and see what's happening there.
Yeah,
So they almost get to 100%, right?
yes, they are approaching 100%. In fact, in 2024, Uruguay generated about 99% of its electricity from renewable sources. And to just paint the picture, 42% of that was hydro, 28% wind, 26% biomass, and 3% solar, and only 1% fossil generation.
That's impressive. But what makes Uruguay interesting is that it was just not about technology.
It wasn't. It wasn't like solar solved everything or wind solved everything. It was a diversified mix of renewables, hydro, wind, biomass, and a little bit of solar as well.
It is interesting because this is not just about technology, it's also about decreasing risk. And there is also policy lessons too.
There is. So Uruguay made a deliberate shift away from imported fossil fuels and built a more domestic renewable system. That's important because decarbonization was not just framed as climate policy. It was about energy security, price stability, and reducing import dependence. You may remember, Carmine, in the resilience episode, I think a couple of episodes ago, we discussed the importance of renewables in the context of increasingly volatile geopolitical environment.
So the Uruguay lesson is 100% renewable electricity is easier when you combine technologies, when the transition is treated as a national strategy, not just a collection of projects.
Yes, indeed. But there is also a word of caution here. Uruguay has favorable conditions. It has very good wind source. It has hydro resources, biomass, and a relatively small power system, which unfortunately cannot be copy-pasted everywhere around the world.
So it's not a universal template, but is very useful proof point and make it possible.
It is. It shows that near 100% renewable electricity, even on a country basis, can work in practice. But of course, the recipe and the details depend on the country in question.
Let's then go on the other side of the world, in South Australia. It's a very different countries, different dynamics.
Yes. And I like this example because it is much closer to the future challenge many grids will face. Higher shares of wind and solar, including lots of rooftop solar.
So South Australia now generates more than 70% of its electricity from renewable sources. It's projected to reach around 85% by 2025-2026 as a target of 100% net renewable energy by 2027.
And in 2023, South Australia met 100% of its electricity demand from renewables for at least part of the day on 289 days of the year.
And that's remarkable. But also raises the difference between 100% for some hours and 100% all the time.
Exactly. South Australia shows both the promise and the complexity of a solar and wind heavy grid.
Because when solar output is very high, the system has to manage minimum demand, voltage, frequency, and export.
Yeah, rooftop solar is one of South Australia's largest power generators at certain times of the year. And that is amazing, but it creates operational challenges. You need batteries, interconnectors, smart inverters, demand response, and very active management of the grid.
And so South Australia is not just a renewable story, it's a grid management story.
Completely. And that's why it is so useful. It tells us that the clean grid of the future is not passive. It is dynamic, digital, and decentralized, and much more actively managed than the old fossil fuel-based grid.
So let's see what this example tells us. If we compare Uruguay and South Australia, there are almost two different pathways.
Yes, so the Uruguay example shows the power of a diversified renewable system that has hydro, wind, and biomass. South Australia, on the other hand, shows the challenge of integrating very high shares of variable renewables, especially solar and wind.
One is national, near 100% renewable story. The other is a sub-national, high renewable grid integration story.
Yeah, and together they teach us something important. Getting to 100% is not just a technology question. It is a system design question.
And this is interesting because it's we focus too much sometimes on technology, and probably technology and solutions already there, but we underlooked what is the system design.
Yes, you need generation, storage, grids, flexible demand, market design, planning, very importantly, public support, and the operational capability as well.
And you need to ask, what is the local resource base? Is it hydro, wind, solar, geothermal, interconnection, nuclear, biomass?
Yeah, the transition will not look the same in Uruguay, South Australia, the UK, India, Germany, or Japan. They will all have their own flavors.
Let's look then on the next chapter. If we look more into detail of the final 10%, the hardest part.
This is where firm clean power becomes important. That could include geothermal, hydro, sustainable bioenergy, nuclear, hydrogen turbines even, long duration storage, or possibly gas with carbon capture.
And this is where advanced geothermal becomes interesting, I would say.
Very interesting. Traditional geothermal is limited to specific geographies, but next generation geothermal aims at to access deeper heat sources in many more places. If it scales, it could provide clean, dispatchable power and heat.
Which makes as a useful complement to wind and solar.
Exactly. Wind and solar are cheap and scalable, but variable. Geothermal could be more expensive initially, but valuable because it is firm and available when the system needs it, almost like a gas plant.
So the future grid may not be about choosing one winner. It's about combining cheap variable power with flexible and firm resources.
That is the right framing. The cheapest kilowatt hour is not always the most valuable kilowatt hour. A clean megawatt available on a dark, windless winter evening may be much more valuable than an extra megawatt of solar at noon in summer.
Rishi, let's go then to the design problem we discussed before that leads to a commercial question. How do we pay for assets that may not run every often, but are essentially when needed?
This is a huge issue. In a renewables heavy system, you can get periods of very low or even negative electricity prices when there is abundant wind and solar.
And this is good for consumers in one sense, but really challenges the business model for especially for some investors.
Yeah, and we know investors need revenue certainty. And the system needs backup, storage, and flexibility, even if those assets are only used occasionally and in some cases may not be used for a long time.
So we need to rethink about the market design and how it has to evolve.
We do. Energy-only markets may not be enough. We may need capacity payments, flexibility markets, ancillary service markets, contracts for difference, long duration storage support, and better locational price signals.
And this is part of the innovation that we need to go through, not just about technology, but about business model. In other words, the old electricity market was designed around controllable fossil generation. Now the market has to be designed around variable renewables, flexible demand, and firm, clean backup.
Yeah, the engineering transition and the market transition have to evolve hand in hand.
So we talk about technology, we talk about innovation, we talk about the design of the problem. There is always the most important variable, I will say, Richie, that is about people. There is the social side of it.
Yes, 100% clean electricity system requires a lot of infrastructure, such as wind farms, solar farms, batteries, as we have discussed many times, and maybe even geothermal wells and hydrogen storage.
Yes, and people may support clean energy in principle, but oppose to infrastructure that are near or needed for this.
Yeah, very frequently in the context of hydrocarbons, we've heard the term NIMBY, not in my backyard. That's one of the biggest bottlenecks. Permitting, planning, public consent can slow the transition as much as technology or finance.
So the communities needs to see the benefits.
Yeah, lower bills, local jobs, community ownership, landowner payments, better air quality, local investment. The transition has to feel fair, not one that is imposed on the people.
It has to be explained to people like what that means. Because if 100% clean electricity becomes associated or perceived with higher bills or an unpopular infrastructure, the politics gets harder.
Yeah, and affordability is not a side issue. It is central to the delivery of this promise.
So is 100% decarbonized electricity possible?
Technically, yes, but not automatically and not and definitely not with a single technology. So not just build solar, not just build nuclear, and not just build more batteries.
Exactly. The answer is a portfolio of wind, solar, hydro where available, geothermal where possible, storage, stronger grids, interconnectors, flexible demand, firm, clean power, and smarter markets.
Yeah, and the examples show that this is not a fantasy. Uruguay has shown near 100% renewable electricity at national scale. South Australia has shown how quickly a grid can move towards very high wind and solar penetration.
But also show that the details matter. Geography matters, grid design matters, market design matters, public consent matters. So maybe the question is not, can we reach 100%?
Yeah, the real question is, can we design the system well enough to make 100% clean electricity reliable, affordable, and politically deliverable?
Yes, that's a much better question. And now let's bring it to close it on this episode, Wrishi.
Yeah, so to close, 100% decarbonized electricity is not just an environmental target. We believe it is a complete redesign of the power system.
And that redesign is already underway. The winners will be the countries, regions, and companies that understand electricity not as a commodity, but as a backbone of the future economy.
Clean electricity is not the whole energy transition, but without it, the rest of the transition becomes much harder.
Exactly. That's for today's episode, Wrishi, of Sustainability Forward. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I did. It was very interesting one. We touched so many angles of this matter.
Exactly. And of course, join us next time when we continue exploring the technologies, markets, and decisions shaping the next phase of the transition. And as always, continue to reach us on LinkedIn and all other podcast platforms under the label Sustainability Forward. Thank you, Carmine, and thank you to our audience.
Thank you, Wrishi.
You've been listening to Sustainability Forward. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow, share, and subscribe. You can find us at sustainabilityforward.com, on all major podcast platforms, and on LinkedIn under Sustainability Forward, the podcast.